Hello and welcome, everyone. We're about to have a conversation with Annabelle Selldorf, an architect in New York City. It's the first in our series of interviews with contemporary architects. With us is Jonathan Duval, a PhD student in our program here at Brown University, and behind the scenes, we're getting help from Gregory Picard and Sean Tavares. I'm Dietrich Neumann. I teach the history of contemporary architecture at Brown, and I'm Director of Urban Studies. This series of interviews is sponsored by the Brown Arts Initiative and by the John Nicholas Brown Center for Public Humanities and Cultural Heritage. And the immediate reason for conducting these interviews was a show, and I'm going to share my screen now, a show that we had planned on the architect Raymond Hood. And Raymond Hood was an architect who went to Brown University and then had a great career as a skyscraper architect. And Annabelle was one of our invited speakers. In the fall, we hope that this show, which of course didn't open on April 4th, will still open at some point. But for the time being, we're working on an internet version that the Bell Gallery is putting up. And these recorded conversations will be part of that launch. I should also mention that another reason for doing these interviews is our architecture major, where there are a lot of students who are interested in architecture and bring together classes at RISD, studio classes at RISD and at Brown. And we try and include a lot of sort of humanities in this training for architects. And I believe that they can learn a lot from you, Annabelle, and your approach. And I just wanted to thank you for joining us here. You're up in Maine, and we're in Providence. We'll have a little East Coast conversation here about your work, mostly in New York City and in Long Island. And I'm really pleased that we can do this. You've had lots of commissions in recent years. Bloomberg once called you the darling of the design world. I think this month you designed the cover for Wallpaper magazine, where one of your new buildings, a new building for the New York City Gallery is shown, and you've won a large number of awards. I'll just mention a few of them. The Public Design Commission Award in New York City, the Built by Women Award. You're also a fellow of the American Institute of Architects, and you were elected into the American Academy of Arts and Letters. And you've received in 2016 the AIA New York Medal of Honor, and also in 2014 already, the award in architecture from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. So thank you for being here. I wanted to begin by asking you how you got to this position. You're from Germany, just like myself, and I think you mentioned somewhere in one of your lectures that while you were born into a family of architects and designers, you hadn't really planned on being an architect. So if you could tell us a little bit.
Yeah, well, I've never certainly been one of those people who say, this is my trajectory and I always knew I wanted to be this. I once heard an interview with Norman Foster, and he's incredibly articulate and charming and charismatic, even when you hear him on the radio. And he described artfully how his trajectory was sheer destiny. I certainly didn't feel that way. I was very ambivalent about working, period. And because my father was an architect, I knew how hard he worked, and that felt like that might really interfere with seeing my friends and doing the things that I wanted to do. And so in that period of doubt, I entertained all sorts of different things. I wanted to perhaps become a journalist or a diplomat or something. And then it was a friend of mine who said we could study interior design. And just to be with that friend, I thought, great idea. I'll follow you anywhere. And my father then suggested that if we were going to do interior design, we had better study architecture. We could still be interior designers. Well, I can make that story as long as you want, but the long and short of it is that I finally realized I knew so little what I wanted to do that I needed to have some practical application. And I spent 2 months working on a small construction site in Germany where I learned to do a little bit of masonry and sort of saw how drawings translated into building. And it was that human quality about all of that that appealed to me, is that in all directions you would come together with people, and if you had an idea, you had to not only justify it, explain it to a client, but you'd also have to understand how it comes together. And that appealed to me because it meant that it wasn't just a remote and highbrowed activity, but rather one that sort of encompasses all sorts of qualities about human life. And of course, I didn't realize that growing up in a family of architects and designers, that was part of what we grew up with, is looking at things, looking at art, looking at buildings, looking at cities. And so that was the beginning of something. But it wasn't really until I enrolled at Pratt, after not having gotten to architecture school in Germany because my high school average grades weren't so great. And so I applied to go to Pratt, which looked very, very different from the way it does in this picture. I got there, I think, in 80 or early 81. And Brooklyn, in that particular neighborhood, was not a very safe place. And Pratt was a little bit down on its heels. Nevertheless, it afforded me a very interesting opportunity to live in New York City. I didn't have a lot of money, so I was lucky to have the support of a friend who was an architect who employed me as an intern and helped me pay the rent. So it was a really interesting experience to live and work in New York City of the 1980s, and studying with people like Juan Downey and Raymond Abraham and Michael Hollander. And I learned to love architecture from a completely different point of view, that at the same time wasn't so distant from what I had grown up with.
Yes, and I just, as a historian, I want to throw in the detail here. I think you described it so beautifully that Pratt looked quite different. This glorious photo now with a much later Stephen Hall edition, of course, makes it look much more glamorous than I guess it was in the 80s. And, there wasn't too much glamorous, too many glamorous qualities about New York in that period anyway. It was
That's right.
It was quite a rough place. I remember that distinctly my first time coming here. But then you went back to Europe, right? And ended up in Florence.
Right. Just as I had always worked going through to school. When I graduated with a Bachelor of Architecture, I went straight to work full time and found myself disappointed with little stimulus in the work life. And a friend said, you should really look at this program that Syracuse is sponsoring. It's an MArch2 program that takes place in Florence. And I applied thinking, never in a million years do I stand a chance to be accepted to this incredible thing. But much to my surprise, I was accepted. It was a small first year of this program, which was then headed up by Werner Seligman, who was really an inspirational teacher. And he had big ideas about this program. He wanted to bring American students to Italy and to study at a high level with really great professors. And he managed to do that incredibly well. I was lucky for a whole year to live and study in Florence, in a very lovely remote place in the hills around Florence, and study with both Werner Seligman, but also Colin Rowe, and a variety of other really fantastic people. And the study there was immersive because it was about understanding architecture of the Italian Renaissance and up to the contemporary times, having intense design studios and tons of field trips all around Italy. And that was really marvelous. Well, you show here in this little picture a place that's called the Villa Rossa, and that is where, that was the center of the Syracuse program. However, it was not inhabited by the likes of me because this is where the undergraduate students had their classes. And to my knowledge, nobody ever sat in that garden, although that may have changed. We instead were a few blocks away in a kind of industrial former garage building where we sort of sat day and night drawing and working away.
Beautiful. Of course, I had no idea. I saw this online. I thought, oh, there's vernacular Italian architecture. I see an influence. I'll, obviously show you in the second year that wonderful house on Long Island that I thought looked a little bit like it. But
well, I thought it was really funny that you made that connection because I could see it right away. If it was an influence, it wasn't a direct one. But of course, I think that this is what happens. We see things. They go into our into the repertoire of our memory or our mind's eye, and you retrieve them and you make connections that aren't always completely obvious.
Yeah, and exactly. And when you just mentioned that you were in this old garage that had been converted, of course, I immediately saw, oh, that makes a lot of sense if you look at some of your work, obviously, when you're taking industrial structures and remodel them. Suddenly there's a whole other connection that comes up. So really fascinating. So before we get into some of your jobs, and we picked a small selection of your pieces of your wonderful work, but I wanted to start, or maybe John can actually take over as one of the buildings that he knows very well here on campus, your fairly recent work at the John Hay Library.
Yeah, we saw this example and thought that it was pretty representative of a large part of your work, where there are these sort of very sensitive alterations and changes to historic structures that, for meeting contemporary needs, whether that be, program and use or even collections care and environmental controls, they're sort of a massive improvement from what was there before. And thinking about these types of projects and keeping in mind your sort of education in Florence, I wonder how you view the role of history in contemporary architecture as a sort of something that foregrounds these designs that you work on.
Well, that's a very nice question. I think architects are often trained to have a kind of singular point of view. And I was trained and brought up as a modernist architect, certainly identify with that. But I also grew up in a very old country that had experienced a lot of destruction in the Second World War, especially the town Cologne, where I grew up. And so there is a kind of reverence toward where we come from, with a curiosity about how how and why things were done in a certain way. And it feels to me completely natural to work with old buildings because something good can be almost always found in old buildings. Not always, but a lot of the time. Certainly when it came to John Hay Library, we participated in an RFP process, and I was thrilled that we won the commission to work with Brown and the librarian and the team there to bring back a kind of unique grand space. And it's actually quite funny, I think, when I look at these photographs, they look so much bigger than the space really is. Mm-hmm. And John Hay Library is actually a delicate space if you were to judge it by its dimension. But certainly there are tons of examples of similar library spaces that far exceed it in space. But here, in this fine scale and proportion, they achieved a kind of grandeur with a relatively smaller footprint, as it were. And that has to do with the tall ceilings. It has to do with the many windows that go around, with the datum of the bookcases. And when we first came and we found the space, it had been sort of chopped up into a variety of sort of sorry looking administrative space. And we did a lot of research on the history and how it had changed. At first it was available only to young promising men who were sitting in that room smoking away. And then it became a sort of hodgepodge of other spaces. And by the time that we were invited to work there, it became very clear that we wanted to just bring back that clear space. And I will say that the thing that I'm particularly proud of is in the next photo, right, is those light fixtures that you see there. Mm-hmm. There was virtually no information about them, but I thought that they were so much a part and such an unusual part of the original space, or present in all of the original spaces over a period of time, that I wanted to bring this kind of playful dancing light device back into the room because it counteracts something that is sort of much more austere and serious in a way. And there was no information on these fixtures. We studied the images very well, and then somebody drew it up, and we worked with a manufacturer to create these light fixtures. And it took a little while to convince everybody to go on this experiment. But I have to say, I absolutely love them. And they really kind of create a tension or a kind of delicate balance that I enjoy about this space very much.
Right, with the large windows and the white paint, the room sort of disappears above the bookcases.
That's right.
But then there are these brilliant light fixtures that sort of remind you that this is an interior, right? And it's sort of anchoring the space. It's really quite special.
Yeah, I think that the other thing that I have to say I'm really proud of is we restored or reinterpreted the original space in a way that doesn't make it look like somebody came in and messed with the bones, but we were able to make it feel fresh so that students actually like using the space, and thereby defying a sort of rule that people have to sit or lie in sofas. Now, comfortable furniture is available here, but there are also library tables, library lamps, and it's a very calm and reassuring space, I think. And it's entirely for the student body. It's not sentimental, it's not traditional in a way that would simply regurgitate an idea that is gone.
Mm-hmm. But still very continuous in a way. When you look at the old photographs, it's really quite wonderful how you brought that back from the rather terrible mess it was in several decades in between. You know, it's really wonderful. I wanted to, as a sort of way to bring us back to New York City and your first commissions. I remember walking in here when it had just been finished and opened, and somebody said to me, you know, this color here on the walls is called super white, because it was certainly whiter than it was before, and it's used in all the New York City galleries. I didn't know about this, and I wanted to ask you if that's actually true, if this is the same color. I think it's strikingly successful when you walk in. It's like a fresh breeze of light that hits you, that puts your mind on alert and prepares you for the great space to come. But is that a particular color that is very common in your work in galleries and so on?
It is. It's a color that I like a great deal because it's not too cool and not too gray. It has a kind of energy to it that I think is very, very nice. And mind you, the place was white before, but it was one of the many whites that is a little bit downtrodden and feels imposing rather than uplifting.
Yeah, I think it looks spectacularly well. So this is like the transition back to your work in New York City. So here you are. It's just such an amazing story. 1988, and you're back from Florence, and you start your own firm. And I was thinking, like, how many firms were there in New York City at that point with a female principal? I don't even, I wonder if, I'm thinking of like Deborah Burke. Was she already? Toshiko Mori? Did Jeannie Gang have office yet? You must have been one of the pioneers, I think, right, with that approach. And it must have taken enormous courage to just start your own.
No. It wasn't at all like that. I came back from Florence and I went back to working in an office, and I had a hard time sort of fitting into an office situation. And somebody invited me to do a small residential renovation that allowed me to pay the rent for the next 6 months, because I really didn't need very much. And I didn't think at all about starting an office. I just thought that I could work on my own a little bit. I had very little experience. Like, I would never hire anybody with as little experience as I had. And the opportunity to do this gallery came about. It's a very long story, but there it was. It was for a German art dealer and gallerist, Michael Werner, who wanted to open this little space. And he contacted a contractor who was doing that small residential job and said, I need somebody to draw up plans. I do not want to hire an architect. I can't stand architects. And that was me. That was perfect. So this contractor said to me, whatever you do, you send a drawing to Germany and you just put dimensions on it. You say nothing else. So I immediately proceeded to think, well, how should a gallery function and what do they need and blah, blah, blah. And made a full drawing and sent that probably with a fax machine to Germany. And a few days later, I received a phone call with Michael Werner saying, okay, that looks okay. How much? How much do you want? And I was like, what? Had no idea. I was not a professional. I was not working as an office. I was working day and night on these drawings, realizing that every step along the way, I had to sort of make design decisions, not knowing whether the client would like them or not. I had not met this client face to face. And in those days, like I said, you had the phone and a fax machine. And he said, okay, it's the beginning of summer. I'll come to New York at the end of summer. And by then you'll have the drawings done and then we can start building. And I was like, okay, great. Off he went, and I was sitting in my hot apartment, drawing away, and increasingly realizing that if my client didn't like anything, I might be in trouble. But there it was. This very simple design kind of worked itself out, and Michael Werner became not only a very good friend, but really somebody who I learned a huge amount from. He had such a keen eye and such an unique disposition to how space is used and how people experience space, that sort of stuck with me forever. I would always say that he was one of the most important people to help me sort of think about how I think about space.
Incredible. And I, you know, as a historian, of course, I couldn't help myself, and I had to throw in a little picture here of this house by Ludwig Wittgenstein in Vienna. And you said, you know, and of course, what triggered it was the incredible thin elegance of the doors you designed here for this gallery in New York, which I thought might have been influenced by seeing images like this. And you said that could have been the case. You knew about this, right? And that was a building.
Well, you remember that little book, who was the author of it, of the Casa Wittgenstein?
Yes,
Oh gosh, now I can't think of the author's name, but there was at the time only this one book available. It was a small hardcover book. Much of my time, my free time in Florence, was spent tooling around the great bookstores of Florence. I don't know that they are still there, but you could find all kinds of books. And that Wittgenstein book was my prized possession, because this house, obviously designed by a philosopher and not an architect, was so interesting to me because it had so many tactile things about it and so many ideas about proportions and things, that I was always fascinated with the sort of resonance of these windows. And absolutely, they were part of my thinking then. They weren't a copy. And I think that what's very interesting is that the Wittgenstein house, in many ways, I don't think is necessarily a great piece of architecture, but it's a great piece of thinking about space. Mm-hmm. And sort of, it's always made me think that as an architect, you have to go further than follow the rules, but sort of make your own arguments and live them all the way through, or follow them all the way through. And so I was really touched that you found that.
Yeah, and I you know, I hope you had or your contractor had an easier time. They're wonderful stories of how Wittgenstein, with his precision, you know, drove his contractors crazy because he had such, you know, thin mullions there and whatever. So yeah, I think it was just so convincing to see what you did to those spaces, and you created basically everything. One of the details that I love, because I think that's really something I hope that the students in our program sort of learn from all of this as well, that sometimes architecture can be just a very small intervention, and it comes down to figuring out things that then suddenly enhance the space. And I remembered in some lecture that you gave, you talked about that diagonal line that you put in here, and actually it was an answer to a problem that you had to solve, right? But it did something to animate the space in a very subtle but powerful way. Maybe you can just quickly tell us about that diagonal line. I just absolutely love it.
Well, you can see that there are really just barely 4 rooms here. So in the course of the however many months that it took to build this space, I ended up knowing every last square inch. And there was a fireplace mantle in the middle of the large room that I wasn't allowed to take away because it contained a chimney that went all the way through the building. And my client said, I must have a single wall. I can't hang my shows if I have a wall that is divided into 3 three segments. And so we just tried to make a single wall. And I thought, maybe you won't see it. And I was naive enough to think that you probably wouldn't see it, or perhaps wouldn't see it. But the truth is, not only you didn't actually understand what it does, because it does, you don't perceive it as an angle, but it creates a kind of dynamic in the space that was really, really great. And the way Western light plays on that wall was very nice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just wonderful, this little detail and what it does to the space and how it solves that problem. I think in a nutshell, that's often what happens in the design process. And just quickly back to this building here. I think probably you're one of I don't know how many houses you've done now in Long Island, maybe 10 or 12, I don't know. It's probably a constantly growing number, I assume, seeing the clients you work with and so on. But this one here struck me. This is probably 1990 or something, or somewhere around very early on in your career, right? And it's just...
Yeah. It's probably later than 90, but I can't remember exactly when it was. It was one of the first houses I built for a chef and his wife, who had bought a small farm on the North Fork of Long Island. And he was a very famous chef, and having a big kitchen where he could hold fort was very important to them. They had very little money, and so we built the simplest wooden structure and played around with proportions. For me, everything starts with a plan. I see everything that's fundamental in a plan drawing, because it allows me to sort of think about how you move in space. And so the elevations come later, and they always give you trouble if you think of them last, because then you have to sort of make them work. And I wanted 5 windows on the top, but I only wanted 4 windows at the bottom. And so I used the old Gunnar Asplund trick, which is to sort of have this shifting geometry. And I must have done 900 drawings of just that one elevation until it finally panned out. But it felt just right.
Exactly. It has just such a calm presence. And I think also in, as I mentioned earlier, of course, I had this great theory that it had been influenced by Italian vernacular. Ideally, that house that I thought you studied in, which was all wrong, of course, but
it's not completely wrong, because it has something to do with the overhang of the roof, right?
Yeah.
I didn't want to make just a flat roof, because somehow that would have felt sort of, I don't know, not right. I don't like it when buildings just stop into nothingness, which does not mean that I don't like a flat roof, and you have to have one. Mm-hmm. But that overhang seemed to give a kind of quality and maybe a little bit of dignity to this very simple building. And so...
Yeah, it has an incredible beauty. I looked it up on Google Maps. It's still there, and it's now painted in an orange that looks very much like this color. So
is that true? Oh my God.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. You have to make a pilgrimage out there. The farm is still there and going strong, apparently, and whatever. So it's just an incredible house. I was blown away. And also the time and the region, I wish there were more of this kind out there, of course. And this is just fantastic. Maybe we'll talk about another of your galleries, and maybe John, please jump in any time. I'll open it by saying I remember walking by this building one day, and it was an afternoon and a sunny day, and somehow the street is going east-west, and there was the setting sun, and the light was just sort of raking the facade, and you could see all the traces of the wooden formwork. And I thought, wow, this is just fantastic, how that simplicity plays out and makes you focus on the material quality there. And it's just probably one of your best known buildings still, right? This is, maybe you want to talk a little bit about it, and I'll let John also jump in there.
Yeah, I think, Dietrich, the fact that you just mentioned the lighting on the exterior is sort of just the tip of the iceberg in terms of light in the structure. So that's definitely an area that we can discuss.
Yeah.
Well, this was a project for also a very good friend of mine, David Werner, who I've worked with for many, many years and on many projects. And he bought a lot where he wanted to build a gallery building that had a large enough space to have very large scale exhibitions. And so we started with the planning, and having worked with David for many years, we sort of had a little bit of a routine in how we would acquire the floor plan, by sort of pushing and pulling and saying certain spaces needed to be a certain size. And we had done this other gallery in Chelsea for him, where we'd studied very carefully how to deal with north-facing skylights and directing light in such a way that it would never hit the wall. And then as the plan gelled into something more solid, David said, what I really want is a concrete building. And there is, for good reason, not many people do cast in place concrete buildings in New York. But we realized that this was sort of a challenge, and we rose to the occasion. There's a wonderful consultant, Reg Hoff, who has first worked with IMP and has worked probably with every architect who's tackled cast in place concrete, and very diligently worked through all of the technical implications. The elevation is so simple that, mind you, anything simple, of course, isn't. But once it had the proper balance, it really was a matter of proper execution. And so the juxtaposition of the very well calibrated wood grain on the facade is something that is as much a part of carefully going through every aspect of it as is the actual wood on the storefront and on the windows above.
Mm-hmm. It makes sense, and of course, it here's that great section that shows us a little bit how not very deep the building is in the upper floors, but it has, of course, the gallery here on the lower floors. And then I couldn't resist. This is the great staircase. And I couldn't resist putting next to it this image here, which is Lucan's stair hall in the
yeah, I find that so amusing because, of course, that makes perfect sense. I, on the other hand, when I've shown this stair, often show a picture of Le Corbusier's stair at La Tourette, which has this sort of very long and skinny free leg of a staircase with the monk walking down the stair. But both are, of course, very much related to one another in the sense that the art of forming concrete and sort of coming to dimensions, again, I keep returning to dimensions, are really important for these kinds of staircase, and how daylight is carried through and how continuity of space on each level informs the entire floor, but also talks about the vertical connection.
Mm. I mean, just one last image, which is, of course, amazing. This could only happen on the first floor. Thank God the gallery is on the first floor, right?
That's right.
Heavy Serra cubes is fantastic stuff. But
I will say that when Richard Serra opened his show, he sort of tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Great building." That was a little bit like, I've got the medal.
Exactly, I can imagine. That's really a wonderful compliment, and he has seen a lot of galleries, of course, but that's really fantastic. Nice. Maybe talking about influence, and Jonathan and I, we often talk about this, of course. I discovered this too in one of your lectures, and I thought another incredible building. And maybe you can talk a little bit more, since we're interested, of course, in precedent and in the humanities and in people who you've discovered as great sources of influence for you. You mentioned you worked for, or I saw it somewhere that you worked for Richard Gluckman, and we've mentioned Foster already, and Kahn now, and others. But who else comes to mind who?
Well, I don't think that those people were necessarily such a big influence. And I think that when you think about it, like who has taught you something is on one end of the spectrum, and who are the people whose work you look at over and again. And I'm not the first nor the last to say that Mies carries the day time and again. So in this project on Martha's Vineyard was an interesting opportunity to work on 3 structures. There was a very old, small cottage style house on the left-hand side that you see there, and then that big brick barn, which didn't exist really, but we found drawings in the local historical society that gave us a lot of information on what one such barn would have looked like. The foundations were there, the arches that you see at the bottom. And because this is a compound for an artist, it made a lot of sense to have a large open barn structure there. And then the next image was that very unequivocal all wood and glass structure that, if I say so myself, is one of my favorite buildings I've ever worked on. It is literally glass all around, but there's no steel in this building. It's all built with within a wooden structure. And it's very simple. It's not very big, but it is a complement to the 2 other buildings. And it kind of hides in the landscape, but commands a quiet presence that is both powerful materially, but also kind of does what one very rarely has an opportunity to do, and that is to sort of absorb the landscape. Yeah, this is a picture that was taken, I think, just about the year after it was done. Today, the field is very well grown in, and it's really a very cool little building. It's not that little, actually.
Mm-hmm. And of course, it has, so many, or at least, for my eyes, it's a part of this wonderful long genealogy, if you like, of trying to create one room spaces that go back to Mies, as you just mentioned, right? And then you have Philip Johnson and Mies again in the Farnsworth House, and then Philip Johnson.
What they all have in common is a degree of resolution. And obviously the topics are very different, where the Johnson building is sort of firmly on the ground, with Farnsworth being off the ground. In our building, and you can't see that here very well, we sort of depressed the structure into the ground and created this sort of carpet of travertine on which the structure sits. And yes, it has to do with placing a structure amidst nature without any peripheral attachments.
And a continuity of the inner, a possible continuity of the inner space, right? You can
exactly.
open all the doors,
yeah.
so that
exactly.
space, or you can in some ways, a slight improvement over the problems that Mrs. Farnsworth faced in her house.
That I was just reading about again. It was very funny.
Yeah, there's a whole new book out, and it's just a wonderful story.
Yeah.
So maybe, well, obviously we've talked so much fun. We've talked much longer than we had intended to. We'll hand it over to Jonathan a little bit for talking about ideas about context. I find these contributions so striking. We have just a few more images, and then we'll slowly wrap it up.
Yeah, I guess earlier we talked about the context of history, but here's, I guess, another type of context, and maybe the one that people associate, with architecture more is this sort of the context of place, the context, the urban context here in this example. And at least to me, you see this integration with context in a lot of your work in New York. And I wonder if you might be able to talk about context with this example here.
Context always matters, and context sometimes is speculative too, right? Here in particular, we're on Lafayette Street and Bond Street, and this is part of a landmark historical district. And to the north are a lot of very rich and monumental brick buildings, and to the south are cast iron structures. And so what you see here is really an attempt to kind of take one's clues of certain proportions, create a new sense of materiality that embraces sort of the north and the south, as it were, by utilizing terracotta or in and around the building. And it was a little bit of a process in going back and forth with the Landmarks Commission. It's a relatively complicated process to make an all terracotta building, but terracotta has been always fascinating to me because it's such a fantastic material. It's existed for such a long time, and it's eminently capable of carrying color and carrying shape, and has a sort of sculptural dimension. I find it a little bit difficult to talk too much about it because I like the idea that in architecture you find yourself using a rational brain to do planning, but allow room for something that is tactile and unique and maybe sculptural. Mm-hmm. What I love about this building is how it captures light, different at any time of the day or evening. And yeah, and there it sits at the corner of Lafayette and Bond Street, and is very firmly part of New York City.
Yeah, and I just love this color. It's almost sort of, if you look at the surrounding colors, it's like as if you had taken several of them and sort of put the sort of essential mix together there that highlights some of the brick colors that you find in the neighborhood and some of the other terracotta.
Yeah, like everything, that's a real process. I had a very small sample that I had picked up somewhere that's like on my little materials altar. Mm-hmm. And we worked for months with the fabricators to make this very color.
And this one, I guess, picks up on the sort of rhythm, almost a Venetian rhythm of the old cast iron storefronts in Soho, and then translates it into a similar rhythm, just on a bigger scale, but still very relatable, which I think is so fascinating.
Yeah, I like this building a lot too, and it would have been perhaps a little bit obvious to work with terracotta here too, but I wanted to create an analogy to the cast iron that had, this sort of novel quality when those buildings were built, and translate the sort of careful layering in the facades of those buildings to something that is much more minimal and maybe more rigorous, but deploys some of the same ideas about proportion.
And the technology that's available today, which of course casts
Exactly.
with the height of what could be achieved at that moment. So just to wrap it up, a few of your high-rise buildings, just very quickly, perhaps you can comment on this one might have been your first high-rise
Yeah.
building, right? And then there are two more coming, and then we'll look at your African project. And
again, I think this is quite similar to what I just talked about. There's like an idea about a neighborhood, an opportunity to relate to the pedestrian scale, if you will. This sits on 11th Avenue and 24th Street. So the base is something that relates a little bit to the Star at Lehigh building, a warehouse building just up the street from there. And then out of it grows a kind of Blossfeld-like, nearly organic structure. And I remember that my father, who was still alive at the time, he said, like, I don't understand this curvature thing that you're doing there. That doesn't look at all like you. I, on the other hand, really like this kind of stainless steel lightness. Again, so much of it has to do with how light moves on the building and even within the building. And the obvious reference to other industrial structures in the neighborhood mattered just as much. And just for kicks, this building has the famous car elevator. So if you own one of the luxurious apartments in this building, you buy with it a garage space, and you can access your garage by taking your car into an elevator that then brings you to your floor where you can park your car. It was a little bit of a gimmick, perhaps, but an interesting one, because we knew that people have cars and there are no garages nearby. And anyway, at the time, people thought that that was rather unusual.
Yeah, it certainly made the building famous. And of course, hearing you talk about the reflections on those curved metal fronts, one thinks of that great sketch of me sitting in front of his curvilinear
Exactly.
and trying to figure out how that.
Didn't you know it?
So just quickly, I mean, your ability to use materials that have a slight difference to these sort of buildings up and down the street and create a new coherence is also obvious in this one here in the Bowery, which is fairly recent, I think, right? It was.
Yeah, it's a very small building. And so, again, a lot of it has to do with sort of using proportional devices. We design buildings really from the inside out, and then layer in materials to sort of articulate a presence along the corner, and always try to find ways to engage passersby on the street with sort of a clear and, again, I'm using the same word over and again, tactility.
And this one is actually prefab parts, right? It's just finished right now.
Well, it's precast concrete panels, and they were, of course, fabricated for us because a building is much technically and constructively, it's a sort of better technique to utilize these limestone-like precast concrete panels. And interesting, because this building sits on University Place, where the scale on the street is much smaller. So we set the building back, which I think is a bit of a risky move in a city where almost all buildings sort of stay in the street front. But in this case, because of the volume, it provides a great deal of relief on the street and gives you more light on the street. And the simplicity of the building is not just my bias toward relentless repetition, but has something to do with these sort of crisp limestone buildings that you find on Fifth Avenue. and as such,
Mhm.
rethinks again opening sizes to wall size, proportion, bringing light into the building, etc. It's
Mhm.
actually a very sort of elegant structure.
Yeah, I agree. And of course, some Miesian moves again come to mind in moving it back from the street front to create an influx of light. And so I just want to end here with this one, which is such a heartwarming project. I wonder if you can say a few words, and then we have one last image I wanted to share. We have two of this one here, that school that you just did in Zambia. Maybe you can tell us. It's so, I mean, all your work is so different. In each single case, you seem to explore materials and situation again from the beginning in a way, from a sort of very open position. And here again, that happened.
Yeah, this school project came about through a friend, Joe Mizzi, who heads up the Plus 14 Foundation, who had made it his goal to make buildings, build schools in Zambia that are an architecture that supports kids. And when he asked me if I would participate, I was thrilled. And I will say that this was a pro bono project. And I sort of wrote an email to the entire office and said, who wants to participate in this project? And almost everybody said, me. And so we all learned a lot. We learned about Zambia, and what you see here is a brick building that is entirely built with compression brick that was made right on site. And the beauty of that, of course, is that very local people, and this is countryside as you can only imagine, were able to learn how to make these bricks, and such learned a new skill, and all the other parts, the large roof, are basically corrugated panels on a simple metal structure that was delivered from the nearest town, Lusaka, and again was able to be put up with relatively little skill, but bringing work to the neighborhood, and then having these unbelievably great kids sort of come to a better place to learn.
And I understood you built the roof first, so you had a place to make the
That's
bricks.
right.
Built
Exactly.
It's absolutely brilliant. Shade, of course, is a huge, hugely important factor there. So, yeah, wonderful. We've taken more of your time than we had planned. This was really fascinating. Maybe Jonathan has a final question. Otherwise, I'd love to just hear in a nutshell, a second or two, how your office runs with your 70 people and so on. But maybe I think we've covered a lot of ground here and touched on a lot of important central questions of your work and of architecture in general. Hand it over to John
Yeah, I
for
think
the final question.
ties together this image of your office, and the last example is sort of the classic question, what is the future of architecture? Where is it going? It seems like there's this push to return a lot of agency in design and in building, and all of these correspondences with education, returning that to the user, to the client. I wonder if you could talk about sort of how you see that sort of emerging culture fitting in with your work in your office.
Well, I think it's an interesting question. Right now people are learning how to cut their own hair. And you can do it by following a YouTube video. I think for architecture, it takes a little bit more than that. And I remember when I was young, people used to say to me that architecture is such a wonderful profession because you can just do it part-time. Or my wife would have been a really good architect. She has such a good sense of color. Now, architecture is serious business, and I joke around a lot, but but we have sort of dedicated our life to it. And it's a particular kind of practice that is based on listening, on ideas that get empowerment through the people who use the buildings. And so listening is a big part of that. And if our buildings look different from one another, then in no small part do they look different from one another because they fulfill different purpose in different places. In all cases, they are for the people who use these buildings. Not one of them is just to give me the pleasure of making a big gesture. Virtually all of them are for people. And in that are ideas about what empowers people, what makes people come together in a more positive frame of mind, and what is what are the rules, if you will? But it's not just about rules. I think it's a back and forth in understanding and absorbing different ways of looking at life. And so I started as a single practitioner, and today the office is somewhere between 65 and 70 people, and each and every one has a strong presence in the office and contributes in their own way. And for me, that is the thing that I'm proudest of, is that this is a culture of collaboration and a culture of sort of wanting the same thing. And there it is.
Thank you so much. This was really wonderful. A full hour of a really interesting conversation. Annabelle, wonderful to see your work, and we look forward to seeing what you come up with next and how your office thrives and creates more things that we can think about and talk about with our students. And I'll probably bring a group down at some point soon to do a pilgrimage to several of your buildings and analyze them together. But this has been really great. I can't thank you for your time and for your spirited contributions to our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed it tremendously, and I look forward to seeing you back in the office.
Thank you. All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, John.